We are back. Sam Seder on the Majority Report on the phone. It is a pleasure to welcome to the program Charlotte Alter. She's a national correspondent for Time Magazine, author of The Ones We've Been Waiting For, How a New Generation of Leaders Will Transform America. Welcome to the program, Charlotte.
Thanks so much for having me. So excited to be here.
Well, I'm happy to, I'm very excited to have you here too, actually, because I am sort of, as a Gen Xer, it's completely generation is completely neglected in the discourse of our society, and I would say with good reason, as far as I'm concerned. I am sort of fascinated by all the changes that are taking place, and am convinced that much of this has to do with sort of like just the structure of generations. But we will talk about that. Your book, you do a story, you essentially write, I guess, views of 10 politicians who are millennials and the events that sort of define who they are and presumably the millennial generation. Let's just start with this. What is a millennial?
Great question. So millennials were born between 1981 and 1996. So what I did for this book was at a certain point in 2017, I woke up and looked around and realized that our government was being led, was a government of old people, by old people, and for old people. And we had the oldest first-term president elected by graying white voters, enabled and encouraged by a Congress full of octogenarians. And I basically realized this is not going to last forever. There is a generational shift on the horizon. And so then I kind of set out to figure out what that generational shift might look like. And so I was specifically looking at elected leaders who fell into that age range, born between 1981 and 1996. So that included some familiar names like AOC and Pete Buttigieg, who both of them, I talked to them extensively for this book. People you might recognize from impeachment, like Elise Stefanik. I tried to make it bipartisan. Lauren Underwood is a Democrat who won a seat in Illinois. But there are also some people in here who you might not recognize who are, operating on the state and local level. And I figured it was important to include them too, because today's state senators are tomorrow's members of Congress and next week's senators. So it's important to kind of look a little bit beyond just the people who are the bold-faced names.
I wanted to hold off on this question, but I just can't help myself. Like, why skip to that generation? Right? I mean,
right.
That is the sort of the fascinating, I think, sort of dynamic that's going on here.
So, I didn't really mean for this book to be a skip of Gen X. It's like I would love for somebody to write the Gen X book. I would be the first person to read it, And this book is, certainly we're going to see, not certainly, I think we're probably going to see a Gen X president like, people in Gen X are like Kamala Harris, Kirsten Gillibrand, Cory Booker are all in that age group. It seems pretty likely that they are the people who are, next in terms of higher office. But what we are seeing, and the point that I make in the book, is that right now millennials are because they are new to the scene and because they represent this kind of new dynamic force in American politics, they're having more impact on the conversation than Gen Xers who've already been around for a while. And so some of the shifts that
without a doubt, I mean, overwhelmingly so. But the thing is, Gen X never had that. I mean, I guess that's what I'm trying to get at. I'm not defensive about this at all.
Yeah.
I mean, I wouldn't write a book about Gen X. Why would you?
Yeah.
There's nothing interesting happening there.
Yeah. So one thing that I, learned in doing a lot of research about generations for this book is that essentially there are big generations and little generations. And there are some generations that where they tend, and there's some I'm trying to be careful about this because some of the research on this is a little bit dubious and kind of like overgeneralized. So I try to kind of talk about it without like, really giving it too much credence, because it's really hard to talk about an entire generation of people, right?
Sure,
but there is some kind of theory on this that basically says that some generations are more like outward facing and civic and more about engaging with the structures of the world, like government and policy and things like that. And other generations are a little bit more inward focused and focused on things like spirituality and art and music and, like dealing with the inner world and less focused on sort of the public realm. And obviously there are many, many huge exceptions. You can list them off the top of your head. But, one possibility is that these bigger generations, like the greatest generation, the baby boomers, the millennials, tend to be a little bit more like, we're here, we're taking over, like it's our turn now. And the generations in between, which are, by the way, just smaller, like we're just
physically smaller. We're just talking about there's less people being born during a certain era. And that's basically it.
Exactly. Because what we're seeing because these generations I just listed, the greatest generation, the baby boomers, and then the millennials, that's like a reverberated baby boom, right? So there were just a ton of people, and in some ways, the generations that are in between Gen X and the silent generation, which is people born in like the 1930s who were kind of kids during World War II and didn't really serve in World War II, but they were alive then, but they were maybe 10 or 11 years old. Like those, there are just fewer people like that. Those were less fertile times, and so. If you look at the demographics, it goes a little bit like, it's like a little bit, it looks hilly kind of. And you have a spike with, obviously after World War II, there was a baby boom and a bunch of kids were born. And then the millennials are the kids of those kids.
Right. And so, I mean,
does that make sense?
Oh, yes, totally. I mean, my theory is simply that the size of the generation dictates their influence on culture. Both because they have the buying power and because if a generation like the boomers, there's so many of them that, after the boomers have had their turn, more boomers are there to take another turn, and then more boomers are there to take a turn, and they're eating up our turn in terms of the Gen Xers, and then all of a sudden, like our day has passed, we're too old to be relevant. And I'm not just talking about myself. I'm just saying this generally.
Absolutely. And listen, the idea that the boomers have held on for too long, definitely, that is definitely true. And I think you're right that there's a sense of holding on. And then at a certain point, it's almost like the Prince Charles problem, where now he's been waiting for his turn for so long that he's not going to be a fresh-faced young leader. He's gonna kind of take over from a position of has-beenness. But I also think that there is a lot of what I talk about in the book is that generations are not really defined. Obviously they are effectively defined by age factually. But what we're talking about when we talk about a generation is a cohort of people who have a similar set of shared experiences and a similar context in which they see the world, right? And that context is determined by the major historical events of the times in which they lived. So, for example, this is why arguments about socialism tend to fall along generational lines, and why when boomers start, spewing arguments about the Soviet Union and Russian aggression and things like that, millennials' eyes glaze over and they're like, what are you talking about? Because they didn't live through the Cold War. They don't remember it at all. The oldest millennials were 9 when the Berlin Wall fell, right? So they have a totally different context for viewing some of these events and ideas. And I think you're totally right that the more people you have in that cohort who share that kind of who share the same sensibilities and share the same context and lens through which they're viewing the world, the more powerful that lens becomes.
And I want to get to the specifics of your book, but this part of the conversation is fascinating to me, because I mean, I agree totally with what you're saying about the wall fell in, what was it, 91, I guess. And the idea of socialism means, as being something spooky, means nothing to people who were, 10 at that age. Although, with that said, Vietnam happened, we didn't leave Vietnam until I was 6. And Vietnam dominated all conversations between age 20 and 30 for me politically. Like, that was all about, it was all about, Bill Clinton, and it was all about how George Bush, we were getting past the Vietnam syndrome and this and that. And I think that's just another example of the boomers still dominating, well beyond their capacity. And had, I think, Gen X been bigger, we still might have had something to say about that. But I mean, really, I've had this conversation with Gen Xers. It's very rare that I find someone who's my age who hid under their desk. It was like the last time where that happened. Anybody just slightly younger than me. And I'm on one end of Gen X. But all right, so let's get to more of the specifics, because I'm really interested about a couple of these people. You start with 9/11, and I guess just talk about how 9/11 informs millennials' perspective.
So 9/11, I start the book on 9/11 because it was, for many of these young people, one of the first big geopolitical historical moments that they remember, right? They weren't alive for when JFK was assassinated. They weren't around for the fall of the Berlin Wall. They didn't live through World War II. This was the first moment that they, oftentimes as young as 12, I mean, AOC was in 7th grade when this happened, began to think of America's role in the world. And 9/11 also was a really important turning point in the way, frankly, that I think coronavirus is going to be also, in terms of the world was divided into before 9/11 and after 9/11, in terms of the U.S. foreign policy posture, in terms of how people within the United States thought about national security and also thought about each other, in terms of whether people thought of the United States as a benign force for good in the world, which was something that had been discussed over and over, but now with the war on terror, there was new doubt cast on whether, American foreign interference was moral or not. And so I think that, the reason I started the book on 9/11 is that millennials grew up in that aftermath. And there are very few millennials who really kind of developed their political ideology before 9/11. It was it was in some ways the starting point for them. And I actually think coronavirus is going to be a very similar starting point for Gen Z. The thing, I think the rule of thumb for this is that kids, young children, or even teenagers really, generally are not paying, unless they're already activists and happen to be really politically active, kids are not paying that much attention to what goes on in Washington. They can't vote. They're not paying taxes. Most kids are not following it closely. The things that get kids' attention and the things that really wake kids up are the things that get school canceled, right?
Right.
And that's why, you don't ever hear, you would have to be like a really unusual kid to say well, when Barack Obama, negotiated the Iran deal, that was a big moment for me. That's very rare, right? But school shootings, kids remember those. Big hurricanes that cancel school in New Orleans or in New York, kids remember those. 9/11, kids remember that. And coronavirus is going to be another thing like that. So I think for millennials, this was just the first big moment where a lot of these young people thought, hey, I'm living through something that is actually a part of history, and now I'm a part of it too.
I want to circle back to the coronavirus thing, because actually that was one of the things I wanted to ask you as to how that's going to impact how Z's reaction to millennials may shape what millennials end up doing. But you did look at. There's a couple of people I want to talk about that that I'm really curious about. I mean, you talked to AOC, you talked to Merrick, who is the mayor of Ithaca, Braxton Winston, who is a member of the city council in Charlotte. But I'm really interested in the ones that are sort of contrary to the way that we perceive millennials on some level. So like Buttigieg, at least in terms of the way that he tried to portray himself, and Crenshaw and Stefanik. Those are the ones that really sort of fascinate me. So let's start with Buttigieg.
Yeah.
When did you start? Sure. When did you start covering Buttigieg, or I guess start to track his story?
So I started covering Buttigieg in 2017, so long before he was running for president, because essentially the first iteration of this book was a story I wrote in 2017 about millennial mayors, and it was about what happens when millennials take over American cities. What changes? What do they do to the environmental development in that city? How do they handle housing? Do they update municipal technology? Things like that. So I talked to him for a while for that story. And we kept in touch, and I could tell even back then, I could tell that he was angling for something bigger, right?
Well, he had run for DNC at that point, right? By 2017?
He was, yes. He was running for DNC chair, but by the time I talked to him, it was pretty clear it wasn't going anywhere.
Right.
Right. So I could tell that he was angling for something bigger. And we kept in touch, and I dropped in on him in 2018. We drove around South Bend together. He drove me around in his little sedan that was full of galleys of his book, and we had tacos, and it was like we were hanging out just like normal people, not like journalist and presidential candidate. Although obviously I was a journalist writing a book about him, which he knew, but and so then it was really interesting to see him kind of transform over the course of 2019 into this presidential candidate. And the thing that I found the most interesting about him is that a lot of the things that millennials in particular hate about Pete Buttigieg, that they think he feels inauthentic, they think he feels practiced, they think he's like Mr. Goody-Goody who like never says the wrong thing, and he's like, too kind of polished. That is exactly the guy that I saw in 2017 and 2018. And I talked to literally everybody who's ever met him. I talked to his mother. I talked to his college roommates. I talked to his friends from middle school and elementary school. I talked to people who knew him when he was 2 years old. Like, everybody says the same thing about him, that's just what he's like. That's his personality. It's not like inauthentic. A show. Yes. And I think that the key fact to remember here is that this is a guy who lived in the closet in a conservative part of Indiana, where he knew no other gay people for 33 years of his life. I think that's very astute. I think that is, and that is a characteristic, I think, that was much more common amongst gay folks in my age cohort and older, because but being in a small town changes that dynamic. I mean, it's a lagging, I think, experience for people. Yeah. And I think that, if you are gay in a community where you don't feel like you can be open about your sexuality, it creates this, from a very young age, he was very conscious of how he presented in the world. He was very scripted. He was very on guard. So that guardedness that people sense about him, that I think a lot of millennials like read as fakeness, it actually isn't fake. It's a personality that he's developed from being in the closet for 33 decades of his life. But the other thing that I want to say about Pete Buttigieg, which I think is really interesting, is that in this presidential election, obviously, he was in the moderate lane, right? But in some ways, looking at somebody like Pete Buttigieg shows just how he is in some ways a bellwether for just how far millennials have pulled the Democratic Party to the left, right? Because the left is always going to be asking for the most left-wing thing, right? That's why they're the left. But Pete Buttigieg, again, a moderate, was asking for a public option on healthcare, massive government help with student loan forgiveness, massive government investment on climate change that included a ton of job creation. Those were all things that the Democratic Party in the 1990s never would have asked for, right?
I mean,
so for a moderate,
aughts,
a centrist,
in the aughts, I mean, 10 years ago,
even,
the Democratic Party would have never asked for.
Exactly. Right. So it in some ways, somebody like Pete Buttigieg, if he's in the center, like measuring where Pete Buttigieg is, can help us understand how far the center of gravity has shifted. Like, obviously, he's still getting all this hate from progressives for not going further than he has. But in some ways, like, even though he's not the AOC and he's not the conversation driver for millennial progressives, he's an example of how successful they've been because if he's the up and coming young moderate, like, that's a lot of progress that they've made compared to moderates of previous generations.
Right. If Pete Buttigieg is the right side of the Democratic Party going forward, that is indicative of huge leaps forward, without a doubt. And I think one of the things I like about millennials is that they don't necessarily, broadly speaking, appreciate that, and so they are relentless in pursuing more. I mean, that's one of the things I like about millennials in that respect. All